Know your place, Miss Clark. This isn't your kind of table. That was the toast that froze a billion-dollar room. The Miller family laughed, thinking they'd put her back in her place. What they didn't realize, Abigail Clark owned half the future they were bragging about. And when she walked away, she didn't just take her name, she took their legacy with her. The empire they built on arrogance began to collapse before dessert was cleared. Stay with us. What begins as heartbreak often becomes power, because every voice they tried to silence deserves to rise louder than before. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever taken the pain they gave you and turned it into your own story? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with love, and ring that notification bell for more powerful stories that honor resilience, courage, and the beauty of becoming. The Miller estate stood like a monument to old wealth. Its limestone facade glowed under soft uplighting, the grand iron gates open for those few whose names carried enough weight to be welcomed past them. Palm trees lined the circular drive in precise symmetry, and fountains whispered at the edges of the manicured lawn. Inside, the marble floors reflected the chandeliers above, each crystal droplet catching the light as if the stars themselves had been persuaded to come down for the evening. It was not just another party. This was the annual gathering of the Miller family and their closest confidants, where deals were hinted at over caviar and reputations were cemented with a handshake. Behind every smile was a calculation. Behind every compliment, a quiet negotiation. It was elegance wrapped in armor, power masked in civility. Abigail Clark stepped from the sleek black car with a grace that did not need to announce itself. She wore a gown the color of midnight, cut in a way that honored her form without needing to beg for attention. Her skin, luminous in the golden evening light, contrasted beautifully against the deep tone of the fabric. No jewelry except for a thin gold cuff at her wrist. Nothing to distract. Everything intentional. The valet looked up and paused, just for a second, before remembering to reach for her door. She gave him a nod, kind but composed, then turned to face the entrance. Her heels clicked lightly against the stone steps as she climbed them, her back straight, her pace unhurried. It was not arrogance. It was arrival. Inside, laughter drifted from the ballroom like perfume. Voices rose and fell in rehearsed cadence, punctuated by the chime of glasses and the rustle of silk. Abigail stepped into the foyer, where oil paintings of patriarchs stared from gilded frames with expressions carved from entitlement. Her gaze swept the room once, quick and precise. These were not her people. She knew that. But she had not come here to belong. She had come because Miles Miller asked her to. At the far end of the hall, he stood near the staircase, tall and lean in a tailored suit that made elegance look effortless. His expression shifted the moment he saw her. There was no surprise. He had always known she would come. But there was something else too, something softer. They had met years earlier in a boardroom where everyone else had doubted her. He had not. Since then, negotiations between their companies had escalated to what could become the most significant private equity partnership of the decade. $5 billion in assets, two industries merging, and tonight was supposed to mark the final stage of that alliance. But alliances, Abigail had learned, were not built in numbers. They were tested in rooms like this one. As she moved through the crowd, heads turned, conversations dipped. Eyes narrowed, then looked away. The stares were not hostile, not exactly, but they held the unmistakable tension of a space unused to making room. She had grown familiar with it over the years, at fundraisers, at galas, in rooms where she had earned her place but was still treated like an unexpected guest. None of it touched her. Her smile remained measured, Her stride was steady. She did not flinch. She did not fold. Tonight would be no different, or so she thought. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight and polished ambition. Waiters in white gloves moved like shadows between tables dressed in ivory linen and gold-trimmed place settings. String music floated from the far corner, light and calculated, offering a sense of refinement that masked the undercurrent of scrutiny already thick in the air. This was a room where lineage meant more than legacy, where last names opened more doors than merit ever could. Miles stood just inside the archway, glass in hand, as Abigail entered. For a moment, the noise receded. The shift was imperceptible to most, but not to him. The way a room tilts when someone unexpected walks in. The way a tide pulls back just before a wave breaks. Her gown moved like it had its own gravity, brushing against the edges of chandeliers reflected in the floor. Her presence changed the temperature of the room. He had known this might happen. His father had offered a careful warning. Not discouragement, but a subtle reminder that appearances mattered. His mother had said nothing at all, which was worse. And still, he had asked Abigail to come, not as a gesture, not as a signal, but because she belonged. His cousins noticed first, the way they exchanged looks over crystal flutes, the way their expressions tightened into polite surprise. Some smiled, some didn't bother. One aunt leaned toward another and whispered behind a manicured hand. It was all there, the carefully constructed performance of civility covering something sharper. Abigail approached him without pause. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. She offered a smile, elegant but reserved, and he reached for her hand with a quiet reverence that did not go unnoticed. Their fingers touched for only a moment, but it said everything. Not business, not obligation. Something else. He guided her deeper into the ballroom, weaving between socialites and senators, the children of oil fortunes and heirs of steel. With every step, the noise returned in fragments. Compliments wrapped in tight smiles, introductions laced with hesitation, the kind of charm that only extended as far as comfort allowed. She moved through it like a tide parting marble statues. Miles felt the weight of his family's gaze pressing into his back, not just judgment, expectation. He had seen it before, turned on others, used to sort those who belonged from those who did not. But this time was different. This time, he was not watching. He was standing beside the reason they shifted in their seats. His mother approached, her diamonds catching the light. Her embrace was brief, her welcome clipped. Miles could feel Abigail's breath stay even, her posture tall. No one had to say it aloud. Every glance already had. As the orchestra swelled into its next movement, he leaned slightly toward her. She didn't look at him, but he felt the question in her stillness. She knew this world, and she knew what it took to stand inside it. The evening had only just begun, but already, the undercurrent had pulled tight. He watched his father across the room, already preparing his toast. The night would unfold in pleasantries and performance, but somewhere beneath the chandeliers and china, something quiet was building, and it had started the moment Abigail walked in. The dining hall glittered beneath a ceiling painted with constellations, the gold trim of every arch catching the light like the room itself was holding its breath. The long banquet table stretched the length of the marble floor, lined with crystal glasses, silver utensils, and orchids so white they looked untouched by air. Conversation hummed in even tones, the kind that carried weight without ever touching substance. Laughter floated from one end of the room to the other, soft and contained, like it had been rehearsed before the guests arrived. Abigail sat near the center, between Miles and one of his uncles, whose cufflinks alone could fund a small startup. Across from her, The Miller family's most loyal investors spoke of art acquisitions and private jets as if discussing the weather. The air smelled of truffle and polished success. It was a world she understood but never belonged to, and that, she thought, was precisely why she was here. Charles Miller stood slowly, the scrape of his chair deliberate. Conversation ceased in an instant. He was a man accustomed to being listened to, his authority woven so deeply into the room that even silence seemed to follow his command. He lifted his glass, the light reflecting against the gold ring that had sealed more deals than any contract. His voice carried easily, rich with confidence that bordered on entitlement. He spoke of legacy, of vision, of the unbroken thread of Miller excellence that stretched back generations. Heads nodded, smiles followed. It was the kind of speech crafted for rooms that already agreed. Then his gaze found Abigail. He paused just long enough for attention to sharpen, a shift so subtle yet every eye followed it. His lips curved into what might have passed for warmth to the untrained observer. But she knew better. His words arrived polished but edged. He spoke of modern business, of progress, of a world changing faster than tradition preferred, and then he turned that same smile toward her. A special welcome, he said to Miss Clark. Proof, he added, that with enough determination, anyone could make it these days if they played their cards right. The laughter came too quickly, a ripple that spread like a spark through dry grass. Some chuckled softly, others too loud, eager to signal belonging. The sound was brittle, hollow, rehearsed. Abigail felt each laugh as a measure of the room's honesty. Her eyes didn't waver. She smiled, not from amusement but from control, the kind of smile that cost more than it showed. Beside her, Miles shifted. His knuckles tightened around the stem of his glass. He didn't speak, not yet. She could feel his restraint. The air between them thickened, heavy with the echo of what had just been said. Across the table, a cousin raised a glass in mock solidarity. Another smirked into his napkin. It was spectacle disguised as etiquette. The toast concluded to a round of clinking glasses and murmured approval. The music resumed, the chatter returned, and the world carried on as though the insult had dissolved beneath the chandeliers. Abigail lifted her glass, her movement slow, deliberate. The wine touched her lips, cool and precise. Her smile never faltered, her posture never bent. But beneath that calm surface, something shifted, not in anger but in decision. The line between being invited and being tested had just been drawn, and before the night was over, they would all learn how sharp grace could be. The dessert plates had arrived in neat rows, each one a miniature sculpture of sugar and perfection. Vanilla panna cotta with blood orange glaze, gold leaf resting on the surface like a final flourish. The air was sweet, but underneath it, tension had settled like a fine dust no one wanted to acknowledge. Abigail kept her eyes on the spoon in her hand, her movements calm, methodical. Around her, conversation tiptoed forward, trying to reclaim the rhythm lost during the toast. But nothing had truly returned to normal. The cousin was seated 3 places down, young enough to still confuse charm with cleverness, old enough to know exactly what he was doing. He lifted his glass high, his voice cutting through the background noise with performative ease. He toasted to progress, to enterprise, and then to diversity. His tone dipped into something just light enough to feign playfulness, but sharp enough to draw blood. He turned to Abigail without turning at all. The words found her like a spotlight. A louder laugh followed, one of those theatrical bursts that carries across the room, inviting others to join, and they did. Not all, but enough. The sound rose, bright and brittle, splintering through the polished ambiance like ice cracking underfoot. A few glanced her way, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Others stared directly ahead, Forks paused mid-air, pretending not to hear what had been said. Abigail sat perfectly still, not frozen, poised, her chin lifted slightly, as if adjusting to a shift in air pressure. The cousin's smirk faded by a fraction, like he had expected a different reaction. Discomfort, embarrassment, even indignation. What he got instead was silence, cold, clear, unforgiving. Miles moved beside her, his body tense, one hand inching toward the table. She did not look at him, but he could feel her signal. It was not a plea. It was restraint. Her control held the room captive more than any outburst ever could. He remained seated, not because he agreed, but because she had asked him to stay still. No one said a word to challenge the cousin. No voice rose to offer correction or apology. The space between the insult and the next sentence stretched long enough to reveal what no one dared admit. That this was not unexpected. That this kind of mockery, dressed in charm, had been served at this table long before she ever sat at it. She returned her spoon to the plate without a sound. Her eyes didn't seek anyone out. They simply observed, quietly, sharply. The kind of look that didn't beg for respect but confirmed its absence. Miles watched the faces around him. He knew these people, their investments, their politics, their charities, their cruelty. He had grown up learning to excuse it, to ignore the subtleties of how power laughed at anything that made it uncomfortable. Abigail didn't need to leave the table to rise above it. She already had, and as the laughter faded and the orchestra resumed its gentle hum, something unspoken passed through the room. For the first time all evening, they began to wonder what she might do next. The room shifted into a delicate balance, teetering between denial and discomfort. Forks tapped against porcelain with mechanical grace, wine glasses raised and lowered in perfect rhythm. It was as if the moment had been sealed inside a crystal dome, set aside as a decorative memory no one would speak of again. The quartet played a soft waltz that folded around the conversation like silk, wrapping the tension in something beautiful enough to ignore. Abigail sat among them like a statue carved in calm. Her face revealed nothing, not even to herself. Inside there was no storm, no fire, just a precise, measured stillness. She watched the way people leaned back into their chairs, how they found new topics, safer ones, foreign travel, property tax loopholes. A recent art acquisition someone had overpaid for, proudly. Across the table, Charles Miller swirled the last of his wine and leaned in to whisper something to a senator's wife. The woman laughed, breathless and appreciative, as if the world had not just curled its lip at the very idea of Abigail belonging in this room. Miles's father had not even flinched. That smile, carved from confidence and years of being unchallenged, still sat beneath his eyes. To him, what had happened was not offensive. It was clever, maybe even tradition. The cousin who had made the remark now spoke to someone else, as though the entire exchange had vanished into the flickering candlelight. He lifted another bite of dessert, his posture relaxed, his power intact. Around him, the others followed suit. The moment had passed. That was the illusion they chose. But Abigail knew better. Silence had a shape. And in this room, it sat like a shadow draped across every polished surface. Not one voice had stood between her and the insult. Not a cousin, not an elder. Not the woman seated across from her who had nodded so politely when they were first introduced. They had let the weight fall on her alone, then rearranged themselves as if nothing had ever been out of place. She had felt this kind of silence before, in boardrooms where she was the only one who entered without a family name stitched into the fabric of the firm, at luncheons where introductions came with double takes and assumptions walked into the room ahead of her. But this silence was older, more practiced. It did not come from discomfort. It came from comfort that refused to be disturbed. Abigail folded her napkin slowly and placed it beside her plate. Every movement exact, every choice deliberate. She had not come here to beg approval, and she certainly had not come to become the punchline of someone else's legacy. The air around her still buzzed with polished performance, but she had begun to see past it, past the chandeliers and the linen and the charm. What lay beneath was not elegance, it was entitlement. She reached for her water and took a sip. It was the smallest action in the room, but it felt like the loudest. With that breath, she began to move from endurance to intention. The silence had spoken, and now so would she. But not yet. The gallery stretched long and silent, a tunnel of polished floors and oil-painted ancestors. Each portrait loomed in solemn symmetry, golden frames catching the low evening light as if guarding the very walls with their gaze. Men in tailored suits stared forward with identical expressions, chin slightly lifted, mouth unsmiling, eyes set in permanent approval of themselves and no one else. The legacy here was not subtle, it was announced with every brushstroke. Abigail stood at the center of it, still in her gown, still composed. Her reflection caught in the glass that covered one of the larger canvases, her face blending with a lineage that never expected to be questioned. She did not speak when Miles entered. She heard him before he reached her, his footsteps slower than usual, not cautious, but considered. He stopped a few feet behind her, silence passing between them like a veil. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, nearly unsure. She didn't need to face him to hear the weight of it. He said he was sorry. The words hung there, suspended, soft but insufficient. She didn't turn. Her hands remained folded in front of her, her posture as upright as the men behind the glass. She told him what he already knew. They didn't see her, they saw disruption, possibility perhaps, but only the kind that needed containment. Her voice was steady, clear, not cold, but unflinching. This wasn't about the cousin's comment or the father's smile. It wasn't even about the silence. It was about the root, about what had been allowed to grow for too long, unchecked, hidden behind champagne and tradition. She told him the terms would change, that this deal they had built for over a year, would continue only under one condition. The Miller Foundation would be required to co-invest in her new equity fund, one designed specifically to support minority-owned startups across underserved communities. Not a donation, not a gesture, a partnership, public, permanent, binding. Miles took a breath. She could feel it, the shift in his stance. He did not argue. He did not flinch. She wasn't asking. She was drawing a line. They both knew what this meant, that this was no longer about financials or forecasts. It was about how far the Millers were willing to go when they couldn't dictate the terms of progress. He stepped beside her then, their reflections finally meeting. He looked at the portraits too, all of them bearing his name. He didn't speak right away, didn't defend them. His silence this time felt different, not passive, not protective, just quiet. She turned to face him, her eyes calm but resolute. The grace she carried had not faded, but something had sharpened beneath it. This was not about revenge. It was about recalibration. If they wanted her brilliance, they would also have to hold her standard. He nodded once. Not out of compliance, but recognition. He saw what his family refused to, and for the first time that night, she believed him. The portraits said nothing. Their eyes remained fixed, unbothered by what stood before them. But the future, Abigail decided, would look nothing like this hallway. The boardroom sat like a crown atop the tower, wrapped in glass that caught the morning sun and scattered it across sleek wood and polished steel. Below, the city stretched wide, a network of ambition pulsing through every high-rise and quiet alley. Inside, the temperature was cool, the silence curated. Around the long table, the senior executives of the Miller Empire waited with clipped smiles and sharpened pens. Their suits were dark, their watches expensive, their expectations clear. Then the doors opened. Abigail entered without hesitation. Her suit was white, perfectly tailored, the kind of white that could not be ignored. It did not blend. It announced. Her heels struck the floor with deliberate rhythm, echoing in a room unaccustomed to being challenged by grace. She took her seat without fanfare, a leather folder in front of her, her hands calm. Across from her sat men who had dismissed her brilliance in private while praising her innovation in public. She met their eyes, unblinking. Charles Miller leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Miles sat 2 seats away, his expression unreadable. The others waited, expecting a conversation about numbers and timelines. They were wrong. Abigail opened the folder, removed a single document, and placed it at the center of the table. The first page bore new terms: bold, clear, unflinching. Her company would retain 51% control of the partnership. There would be a reinvestment clause requiring a fixed percentage of annual profits to fund social equity programs. And finally, a restructuring mandate. Leadership roles across both entities would be reevaluated for diversity and inclusion, with quarterly audits and public reporting. The air tightened. No one reached for the document. One executive shifted in his seat, another cleared his throat. It was the kind of silence that did not know what to do with conviction. They had expected negotiation. They received a blueprint. Abigail did not fill the space with apology or explanation. She let the proposal sit, let it challenge the very foundation they had built careers upon. She had been brought to this table because her company offered what they lacked: reach, innovation, credibility. But now they would have to decide if they truly wanted her terms or only her name. Charles's voice finally broke the silence, slow and careful. He asked if she was serious. She met his eyes and answered with the stillness of someone who had already decided. Across the table, Miles leaned forward. He looked at the document, then at her. His silence held no resistance, only respect. And then, softly, he nodded. The others remained quiet. They had never been told no by someone who didn't need them. Abigail gathered her papers and stood. The deal, she said, was no longer about access. It was about accountability. She would give them 1 week to respond. And with that, she walked out, leaving the weight of her expectations behind her. The door closed softly. For the first time, the boardroom did not feel like a seat of power. It felt like a test. The room had not cooled since Abigail left. It had curdled. The silence that followed her exit sat thick and uneasy, like smoke that refused to lift. Charles Miller stared at the empty chair across from him, one hand resting on the arm of his seat as if to steady himself. The executives avoided his eyes. No one spoke. By the time he called for a private meeting later that day, his expression had hardened into stone. His fury arrived not in volume, but in precision. He sat at the head of a smaller table, this one darker, less ceremonial. The blinds were drawn, the city outside replaced with shadows. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. His anger was exact, each word placed with surgical intent. She was out of line, he said. She had no understanding of what it meant to be part of this world, no appreciation for the history she had walked into. He called her demands dangerous, disruptive, arrogant. And then finally, he said it. She was overreaching. The words hit the table like a gavel. Cold. Final. The others sat still, watching him with the wary stillness of men who had made fortunes by knowing when to speak and when to disappear. Miles leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands folded. His face gave nothing away. But his silence was not agreement. It was waiting. watching. Charles turned to him last. His voice lowered, his tone sharpened. He said Miles had been blinded, that bringing Abigail into this family, into this deal, had been a mistake wrapped in sentiment. He called it naive, reckless, misguided. Miles answered slowly, not with fire, but with clarity. He told his father that sentiment had nothing to do with it, that Abigail had built something extraordinary, that she had never asked for permission, only partnership, that her demands were not overreach, they were overdue. The room stilled again. Charles narrowed his eyes. His disappointment no longer veiled. He told Miles that a man who could not control his alliances had no place leading the future of the Miller name. Miles stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He simply said that if control meant silence, then it was a future he no longer wanted. And then, like Abigail, he left. By the end of the day, Abigail's firm issued a formal withdrawal from the deal. The press release was clean, professional. A line at the bottom cited philosophical differences. The market responded first with confusion, then with questions. Investors called. Emails poured in. Analysts speculated. Behind closed doors, murmurs turned to unrest. The Miller board scrambled to manage the optics, but the headlines kept coming. A legacy company had been publicly challenged. A billion-dollar deal dissolved not over numbers, but over values. Abigail said nothing. She did not need to. She had walked away not just from the table, but with her integrity intact and her influence magnified. The seat they refused to share became the seat they could no longer fill. The first headline dropped like a stone into still water. By morning, it had rippled across every major outlet. Clark Innovations withdraws from $5 billion Miller deal. The numbers alone were enough to make people look twice, but it was the subtext that caught fire. Whispers of conflict, allegations of bias, rumors of something deeper than just a failed negotiation. Inside the Miller Tower, phones rang non-stop. Analysts demanded answers. Board members scrambled to compose statements. The press department issued a carefully worded release blaming irreconcilable business philosophies, but it only fanned the flames. Because beneath the corporate jargon, everyone could see what had really happened. Something had cracked. And now, it was unraveling. Stock prices dipped, then dipped again. Not catastrophically, but enough to make shareholders nervous. Enough to make people start asking questions they never bothered to ask before. Who exactly had been at that table? What had been said? And why had a woman like Abigail Clark, a woman whose company was outperforming most of its competitors, walked away without blinking? Reporters camped outside the Miller offices, their questions sharp, their microphones waiting for sound bites that would confirm what the silence already suggested. The empire had not lost a deal. It had lost its facade. What began as damage control shifted into full containment. Charles Miller held closed-door meetings with legal teams. Executives were told to keep public statements vague. Internally, there were talks of stabilizing the brand, of reshaping the narrative. But the damage had been done. Quiet conversations began to circulate among younger partners and staff, who wondered aloud whether the culture at the top was sustainable. Some even resigned, quietly, but deliberately. Then came Miles. He issued his statement 2 days after the fallout began. It was brief, a single page. The last paragraph cited ethical differences. The opening line made it clear. He was stepping down. No press conference, no handoff. Just a clean exit and a choice made in full view of the same people who once called him the future of the firm. The boardroom murmured with betrayal. His father refused to speak to him. But Miles no longer needed their approval. He had seen what the mirror looked like once it cracked, and he wanted no part in polishing its surface. Meanwhile, Abigail remained silent. She did not correct the stories. She did not explain herself. She let the collapse speak for her. and the world listened. In industry circles, she became more than a CEO. She became a signal. That influence could be wielded differently, that partnerships were no longer charity or symbolism, but decisions with consequence. She had not set out to destroy anything. She had only asked to be treated as an equal. It was not her refusal that caused the collapse. It was their refusal to meet her there. And now, what had once seemed untouchable was beginning to unravel, one silent reckoning at a time. The sun warmed the concrete steps outside the newly renovated building, its glass facade reflecting a skyline that no longer seemed out of reach. Banners rippled in the light wind, each printed with the name that now carried a weight beyond profit: the Clark Collective. It wasn't just a foundation. It was a statement, a blueprint for what could be built when the door stayed open instead of closed quietly behind you. Abigail stood in front of the entrance, one hand holding a length of silk ribbon, the other gripping the scissors with the same quiet control she had brought into every room that once questioned her presence. Around her stood entrepreneurs who had been told they were too small, too unpolished, too different. Today, they stood beside her, ready to carve paths of their own. The crowd gathered in semicircles. Journalists scribbled in notebooks. Photographers caught the glint of sunlight against steel and glass. The air buzzed with the feeling that something real was happening, not a spectacle, but a shift. She spoke briefly. Her words, like her presence, were measured and certain. She talked of opportunity, of accountability, of what it meant to build systems that did not require permission. She did not name the Millers. She didn't need to. The silence behind her success was already filled with everything they had failed to do. At the edge of the crowd, Miles stood in a gray suit that didn't carry his father's tailoring or his family's name stitched into the collar. He stood with his hands in his pockets, no longer expected to speak for a legacy that had crumbled behind him. When Abigail's eyes found his, something passed between them. Not reconciliation, not regret. Just a quiet recognition of the line that had been drawn and crossed with purpose. He offered a small nod. She returned it with nothing more than a breath. Then the ribbon fell. Applause rose in waves, cameras clicked, the doors opened, and people began to step into the building that had once been a brokerage firm and was now a home for something far more radical: possibility. Inside, offices waited with glass walls and open desks, meeting rooms named after women who had built without permission. A plaque near the entrance read, "Built for the unseen, by the unstoppable." Abigail walked through the lobby without needing to pretend anymore. The weight that had once come from proving herself had been replaced by something steadier. Not vindication, not victory, just peace. She had not answered mockery with fire or fury. She had answered it with structure, with legacy. She paused in front of the central atrium where the light streamed in unfiltered. Her reflection looked back at her from the glass, not as someone who had been allowed in, but as someone who had taken up space and then built more of it for others to stand in. Power was not inherited. It was not bestowed. It was built. And what they had tried to measure in her presence had never been up for negotiation. It had always been hers. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.